So we left off last time with this assumption of symbolic interactionism that meaning is actually conferred by a self. And developing a concept of self is something that Mead took seriously. And he stressed this idea in light of some prevalent theories that were around at the time when he was doing his writing. And in particular, as Boomer points out, he's taken on some dominant psychological theories of the age and also then some sociological ones. So the main psychological theory he's taking on, or school of psychological theory that he was taking on, was behavioralism, and the idea that people could be conditioned to have an automatic reaction or response to a certain stimulus. So something happens, action leads to automatic reaction. And the key word here, or the key idea, is that this is automatic. It happens unthinkingly. And the most famous example of this is Pavlov's dog, where Pavlov had a dog. Each time the dog was fed, he would ring the bell. Pretty soon, the dog associated this stimulus of the bell ringing with being able to eat. And the dog's response was he's associating the bell with food, and the response was that he would start drooling or salivating because anticipating he was going to eat. And so Pavlov was able to condition his dog to have this automatic and physiological response to this particular stimulus. And for a long time, some psychologists thought that we as humans could be conditioned the same way, that if we're trained right, conditioned right, then certain inputs are going to automatically lead to certain outputs, again, simultaneously and automatically. Now, Mead was also taking on some dominant sociological theories, or can be seen as taking on some dominant sociological theories, that even though they're different in the content of the argument, the form of the argument is basically the same. So here the idea is that certain social conditions are going to lead to an automatic response. So in other words, social conditions kind of flow through the individuals and they do things automatically or unthinkingly. And we could argue that Durkheim falls into this model of, or puts forward a model or form of this argument with this idea about social facts. And social facts are certain social conditions leading to these automatic responses on individuals. And so, for example, when we were talking about suicide, Durkheim thought that different social conditions, higher or low levels of regulation and integration, can lead to this outcome in individuals. And it may lead to this outcome without individuals actually knowing why they are, say, feeling despair, and that leads to suicide. So, for both the psychological theories and the sociological ones, a certain condition leads to this automatic response. And Mead wants to challenge this line of thinking. And Mead does this by arguing that between a certain stimulus or a certain social condition and this response, there's a process of interpretation, and that takes place within the mind or within the self. So we have stimulus, interpretation, and then response. And that interpretation can radically influence how we are going to respond to a certain situation. So there's another way of saying that there's this pause that occurs between action and reaction, in which we think about the situation, we figure out how we're going to interpret it through our mind and through ourself. And based on our interpretation, we are going to react in a particular way. Now, normally this discussion lines up well in the fall semester, because it usually occurs around Halloween. But who knows whether we're going to have Halloween or what Halloween's going to look like this year. But generally when we talk about this, we talk about it in the sense that if I hear a knock on my door late at night, that's a certain condition. And I open the door and I see someone with a mask on, maybe brandishing a weapon, and who's asking for some of my property, normally in light of this stimulus, I'd have the responsive say of shutting the door really fast and locking it, running and calling 911, getting a gun to defend myself. But when the same situation happens on October 31st, on Halloween, I open my door, I see people wearing masks, asking for some of my stuff, in this case it being candy. I understand, I interpret the situation differently than if it happened, say, August 31st. I understand that these people here trick-or-treating, and so my response is to, again, give them candy or whatever and give it away on Halloween. And again, Mead's point, it will seem subtle, but it's actually pretty profound, is that this happens all the time. We are bombarded by a lot of different information that could be interpreted a number of ways. And we actively interpret the world. We interpret a lot of this information we receive. We give it a particular meaning, and then we respond based on our understanding of the situation. So again, if someone says something like, oh, the weather's terrible out today, I can understand that they might mean those words in a sarcastic manner, or they're saying something ironically. So I understand their words different than what they literally mean, and then I can respond accordingly. I can laugh and chuckle, as opposed to thinking, wow, this person really has no idea what's going on, right? The world is terrible, and they're talking about how good the weather is. So it's because we have a mind that we're able to interpret and give meanings to things. So between the stimulus and response, there is a self, and the self's job is to interpret these situations and give them meaning. So another premise of symbolic interactionism is that meaning is derived from or arises out of social interaction, which is another way of saying that meaning is collectively negotiated. And is another way of saying that meaning is fundamentally a social process, or deriving meaning is a fundamentally social process. Because it can be tempting for us to think of meaning in terms of what does this mean for me? And it could be tempting to think that meaning has a certain kind of individualistic aspect to it, right? I understand something in this particular way. And that can be true in certain circumstances, but ultimately, most, and probably in many cases, virtually all forms of meaning have a completely, or if not significant, social component to them. And this is because what we do is social action, and social action is based on what Mead refers to as significant symbols, which these are symbols with shared meaning. In that, when I use certain words or certain phrases, I am assuming that you understand, or at least have a broad enough shared understanding for what I'm saying to understand, and that we can act collectively. Now, since Mead is influenced by pragmatism, which we talked about, you don't have to understand. I have a perfect correspondence in terms of your understanding in comparison to what I'm saying. But if you understand it enough that we're able to negotiate our interactions and engage in a joint action, then for all intents and purposes, we have significant symbols. We have things with shared meaning. So for example, in the American context, if we are to see a streetlight like this, we understand that if the red light is on, we understand that we're supposed to stop. Yellow, we're supposed to slow down, and green, we can go. Now, we've understand this because we've learned it. So in the American culture, this is a significant symbol. There could potentially be other cultures that haven't experienced traffic like this, and it wouldn't be a significant symbol. They wouldn't know how to make sense of it. But at least within the American context, we've been taught that these different lights represent different actions. And because we collectively understand this, that means we're dealing with a significant symbol, symbols with shared meaning. That's in contrast to this, which is a picture of a mathematical formula, and I just Googled complex mathematical formula. And for certain communities, these symbols would represent a significant symbol. There would be shared meaning within certain mathematical communities. But for the general population at large, this wouldn't be a significant symbol because most people wouldn't understand what the symbol is supposed to represent. All right. But the broader point is that a lot of what we know and a lot of how we communicate with others is anchored in significant symbols. And within our cultural context, there's a huge reservoir of significant symbols that we can draw from, and where the meanings of things are shared enough between members that we can then engage in joint action. If meaning were completely individualistic, though, right, if everyone had a different understanding of what red light means, then there'd be kind of like social chaos and anarchy because no one would be able to understand anyone else and we wouldn't be able to engage in kind of cooperative action. The fact that we're able to coordinate so much of our actions with others shows the extent to which social life rests on the use of significant symbols.